Imagine this, it's 1907 and the entire US economy is on the verge of collapse. But then one man steps in to save it. But what if I told you that this man wasn't a president or even a politician? He was a banker. I want to show you how JP Morgan didn't just influence finance, he changed the rules of the game. I mean, this guy was so wealthy that he was asked to save America's economy twice. This is the story of John Pierpont Morgan, a banker that saved America from collapse. Here's the thing, to many people, JP Morgan was a hero. He essentially saved capitalism from collapse. But to many others, he was the embodiment of greed and monopoly. And over time, this kind of criticism and constant public scrutiny eventually wore him down. By his final days, he was a shadow of the man he once was. He was frail, isolated, and he suffered mentally. But before we break down why exactly the final days of his life was so miserable, we need to understand where he came from. Now on this channel, we talk a lot about great financial figures who come from humble backgrounds. But this was not the case with John Pierpont Morgan. I am not exaggerating when I say that he was born into a family of immense privilege in 1837. His path was paved with opportunities only a few could dream of. His parents and many of his relatives were already prominent members of the elite American society. I mean, James Pierpont was his maternal ancestor and he co-founded Yale University. And then you have his grandfather, who played a key role in establishing the Aetna Insurance Company. And then you have his father, Junius Spencer Morgan. He transitioned from running a Hartford dry goods company to becoming a partner in a prestigious London-based merchant banking firm. With these connections, it's no shock that JP Morgan, when he came of age, had a huge leg up in his career. Because now it's 1856, and guess where JP Morgan starts his financial career? I mean, of course he enters the world of banking through his father's London branch. Before we get into the juicy details of how he bailed out the entire country of the United States of America, let's run through his credentials to understand what made him so successful. So, he enters the world of finance through his father's banking connections, as I said. The following year, he moves to New York to work at Duncan Sherman and Company. Basically, this firm was affiliated with George Peabody and Company, which was one of the most influential merchant banking firms at the time. This is where he gains a huge amount of experience in finance and access to an elite network of financiers and industrialists. This then allows him to launch J. Pierpont Morgan and Company in 1860. This is where he spends the next few years serving as his father's agent in New York. Now, while his career is booming, he's called in to serve during the Civil War, but he avoids military service by paying for a substitute soldier, which was, by the way, completely legal at this time. Not only did he avoid serving in the Civil War, he actually saw a business opportunity here. He ended up supplying war materials and turning a handsome profit. But he quickly got into trouble for this as he sold some defective rifles to the Union Army. Investigations were conducted, but he had really good lawyers, and they managed to prove that he didn't know about the gun's conditions prior to selling them, thus absolving him of any intentional misconduct. Alright, that was a lot, but you have to admit that it's a pretty impressive resume, and it gives you an idea of how he built his business and financial acumen. It shows you that he was smart enough to use his privilege and influence strategically to get out of some really tight spots. Now let's look at 1865. The Civil War just ended, and around this time an economic boom was sweeping across the United States of America. The country was industrializing at a very fast pace. Large financial establishments, like the one of JP Morgan, were poised to take immense profit from this. Remember the George Peabody Company I mentioned earlier? Well, Morgan's ties to this firm gave him privileged access to London's financial elites, and he did not shy away from using these connections to secure capital from his British peers. The rapidly growing United States was hungry for foreign investments, and there he was, JP Morgan, ready in his element, ready to play the middleman. He ended up becoming a partner in a New York City firm called Drexel Morgan & Company. And partnering with Drexel didn't just boost Morgan's own reputation, it also put the firm front and center in funding big infrastructure projects for the US. Soon, Drexel became a major player in financing US government projects. That's why this era marked the beginning of Morgan's rise as one of the most influential figures in American finance. He wasted no time asserting himself. He aggressively expanded his empire, targeting this era's most critical industry, railroads. Now, I know what you're thinking. What does transportation and railroads have to do with finance? Stay with me here, because Morgan used railroads industry to make a ton of money. Here's exactly how he did it. He started by seizing control of a big railroad operation in 1869. Around this time, there was a monopoly of government financing when it came to railroads, and that motivated Morgan to lead a syndicate that helped break these existing government financing privileges to just a few select players. This move opened the door for Morgan to dive deeper into the railroad development and consolidation business. The gist of it is that Morgan essentially benefited from the railroads industry by implementing key reorganizations and consolidations, turning struggling railroads into more efficient operations. He essentially gained control of the railroads, raised large sums of money to support them, and worked to integrate the US transportation system overall. Morgan's process of taking over troubled businesses and reorganizing them was known as Morganization. This is actually a philosophy that many major consulting firms do today. It's called right-sizing or downsizing businesses. You see, Morgan had a vision to create a countrywide integrated transportation system, and his relentless quest for efficiency was key to reaching his goal. Up until then, the American railroad industry had been going through its Wild West era. It was largely unregulated, and it allowed large financial firms to operate as they pleased. That's where Congress attempted to rein in the industry, and that's why they passed the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887. But you see, Morgan was strategic and forward-looking, and he knew that this was coming. That's why he immediately took action to organizing industry conferences, arranging coalitions and meetings amongst competitors in 1889 and 1890. And during these meetings, Morgan brought together railroad presidents to set fair, stable, and uniform rates. This way, he created a sense of cooperation amongst competitors. With this brilliant move, he turned a crisis into an opportunity and transformed cutthroat rivalries into coordinated efforts to stabilize the industry. This consolidation of competitors and stabilization in the railroads industry only meant one thing for Morgan: a ton of profit for his own firm. Because you'll remember that he indeed was the main financier of all these railroad tycoons. He was very smart and asserted his dominance because near the turn of the century, Morgan had gained control over vast portions of the railroad industry. According to some estimates, nearly 1/6 of America's rail lines were under his influence or direct management. But here's the thing, he wanted more. As impressive as his railroads empire was, Morgan had even grander ambitions to further expand his influence over the US economy. And this time, he set his sights on another industry, electricity. Because now it's 1891, and he's achieved one of his most significant milestones, arranging the merger of the Edison General Electric and Thomas Houston Electricity Company. The result was General Electric, what we know today as GE. And this massive behemoth corporation quickly became the dominant electrical equipment manufacturer in the country. But there was a small roadblock. The problem was that his involvement in electricity and trying to build up this industry directly challenged another industrial titan by the name of John D. Rockefeller. You see, Rockefeller's company was Standard Oil, and it thrived on the demand for kerosene to light America's oil lamps. So Rockefeller found himself increasingly threatened as electrical lighting began to replace traditional fuel. He responded to Morgan's electrification push with a fierce smear campaign. I mean, Rockefeller went as far as planting scare stories in the press, warning the public about the supposed dangers of electricity. But his efforts were in vain. The benefits of electricity were undeniable. I mean, people just saw it. The rapid adoption signaled the dawn of a new era. I mean, Morgan's vision won out, cementing his role in shaping the future of the energy industry in America. By the way, I made a full video about John D. Rockefeller and his legacy on the oil industry here, so make sure to check it out. Also, please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It really helps me out. Anyway, so we have railroads, electricity, but then again, as you know John D. Rockefeller by now, this was not enough for him. I mean, he already had a firm grip on a huge chunk of the US economy, but his next venture would give him even more control over the country. He set his eyes on a new target, and that was steel. Morgan had his eyes on steel for a very long time. Following his father's death, JP Morgan assumed full control of his father's financial empire, but he wasted no time coming up with a plan to bring in the steel industry under his command. In 1900, he began talks with Charles M. Schwab, the president of Carnegie Company. In fact, he was also engaged with the famous industrialist Andrew Carnegie directly, and his goal was to buy Carnegie's business and several other steel and iron businesses to consolidate them into one and create the United States Steel Corporation. By the end of their meeting, Carnegie agreed to sell his business to JP Morgan for $480 million. Adjusted for inflation, today that would be around $17 billion. and at that time, that amounted to nearly 3% of the US GDP. What's interesting though is that this massive deal took place without any lawyers or a formal contract. It was just a simple handshake. Like I mentioned earlier, this deal merged Carnegie's businesses with several other steel and iron companies and formed the United States Steel Corporation with an authorized capitalization of $1.4 billion. At this point, JP Morgan had founded the world's first billion-dollar corporation. His company didn't just dominate steel production, it controlled construction of bridges, ships, railroads, cars, rails, and countless products like wire and nails. At its peak, US Steel commanded 2/3 of the steel market, and it was well on its way to an eventual market share of 75%. Morgan's influence was now unrivaled. By the turn of the century, JP Morgan oversaw one of the most powerful banking houses in the world. It drove massive deals, reorganizations, and consolidations across industries. He broadened his control over manufacturing and mining operations, insurance companies, shipping lines, and communication systems. I mean, think about that for a second. JP Morgan wasn't just a player in one industry. He was shaping the entire American economy from manufacturing to communications. It's hard to imagine that much power with just one person, right? Well, his influence was about to grow even more. By now, Morgan's influence was so strong that people looked to him to save the economy in times of crisis. His ability to command resources and rally key players made him a critical figure during moments of crisis in an era when the United States lacked a central bank. You see, in 1895, the country faced a major financial crisis that threatened the gold standard, and it was Morgan who led a banking syndicate to loan the federal government over $60 million in gold. This bold move helped stabilize the economy and restored public confidence in the nation's monetary system. In essence, JP Morgan bailed out the country. He helped stabilize it. It goes to show just how much power he had. But that wasn't the only time, because if you fast forward a decade later, the United States was in trouble again, unsurprisingly. There was another financial crisis. So in 1907, the markets were once again in turmoil and financial institutions were on the verge of collapse. And guess who steps in? That's right, JP Morgan. He gathered the nation's top financiers into his New York home, and there they led negotiations. The negotiations were tense, but in the end, they managed to convince them to pool their resources and bail out the failing institutions. This prevented a complete economic meltdown. I mean, it's the second time that JP Morgan came in to save the country from financial failure. By the early 1900s, JP Morgan had reached the pinnacle of his career. His firm and its partners controlled assets worth a staggering $1.3 billion. I mean, this is worth $48.85 billion in today's money. Morgan was now without question the most powerful financier in American history. Perhaps even today, no other individual financier could match Morgan's stature at his height. But the thing is, this kind of power and massive influence did not go unquestioned. Critics started to become more vocal. They argued that his concentration of wealth and power undermined free competition. People feared that there was too much control over the economy being placed in the hands of just one man. This growing concern was foreshadowing some of the major challenges that Morgan was about to face. You see, over time, the so-called hero who once saved the American economy not once, but twice, became a villain in the public's eyes. He started facing growing accusations. Progressive politicians, journalists, even jaded members of the public were all accusing him of wielding excessive power. Many even claimed that he manipulated the financial system to serve his own interests. JP Morgan's dominance was first challenged in 1912. He was summoned to testify before a congressional committee. The committee was investigating the so-called Money Trust. This was a group of elite Wall Street financiers, and they were accused of colluding to control the American banking industry, and Morgan was singled out as enemy number one. These committee hearings were important because they marked a turning point in the public perception about JP Morgan. Now, don't get me wrong, he was still a financial giant, but this inquiry highlighted growing concerns about concentrated economic power. It signaled a shift towards greater regulation of banking and industry. JP Morgan was the face of American capitalism, defined by vast wealth and also unchecked power. But this was now the beginning of the end of an era. Around this time, Morgan had stepped back from actively participating in his businesses, but he couldn't really enjoy a peaceful retirement. In fact, it was quite the opposite of peaceful. He spent the last few years of his life under intense pressure and scrutiny. Remember those committee hearings I mentioned earlier? Well, they took a very heavy toll on him. Even though he held his own during these proceedings, the experience was deeply unsettling and it marked a decline in his health. His condition worsened when he suffered a mental breakdown and he experienced severe anxiety and paranoia. Morgan began to lose his sense of reality. He was convinced that there were these outlandish conspiracies against him, including a fear that Egyptians were plotting to kill him. So yeah, he wasn't in a great place mentally or physically. In fact, just a year after these hearings, JP Morgan passed away. He left his vast empire to his son, JP Morgan Jr. However, his son lacked the same talents and vision that made his father so successful. His son could do very little to prevent the sweeping financial reforms of the 1930s, including the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, and this legislation required the breakup of Morgan's financial empire into three separate entities: JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, and Morgan Grenfell. Two of these three still exist today with market caps of $700 billion and $217 billion respectively. And even a century later, the firms founded and built by JP Morgan continue to shape the financial world. The House of Morgan reached its peak under JP Morgan Sr. However, his death contributed to an even steeper downfall. Today, nobody from the Morgan family stands out as a billionaire or even a major player in global finance. But you can still see JP Morgan's enduring legacy in other ways. I mean, Morgan's influence on modern finance is nearly impossible to overstate. His leadership played a key role in shaping American economy. He funded railroads, steel mills, and industrial giants, and he became the backbone of America's rapid industrial growth in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, he also introduced groundbreaking practices that revolutionized the financial sector itself. He pioneered modern investment banking techniques, including underwriting securities and facilitating mergers and acquisitions. He created special syndicates to underwrite and distribute securities. His firm pioneered financial groups, and these groups brought together banks and investors to pool resources, share risks, and tackle large-scale financial projects. Before Morgan's time, individual banks were not able to fund massive ventures, but because of him, it was now possible to finance mega projects with unprecedented scale and complexity. At a time when the US economy was fragmented, these groundbreaking practices drove the consolidation and expansion of the American industry. And these innovations are now considered just standard practices in corporate finance, and it speaks volumes of Morgan's reputation as a financial pioneer. Before JP Morgan, America's financial landscape was dominated by merchant banking. Merchant banking was basically small-scale, relation-driven ventures focused on limited regional investments. But with Morgan's influence, the banking landscape completely changed. It was now dominated by massive mega corporate banks driving national and global financial operations. JP Morgan also helped shape how modern corporate finance works. Under Morgan, the firm started really digging into the numbers and looking closely at companies before investing. He made sure to check company records and leadership, and this set a new standard for doing your homework and making smart, informed decisions. This practice of financial due diligence and background checks is now normalized in the venture capital world today. But perhaps Morgan's biggest legacy is the concept of Morganization. I mentioned this earlier in the video, and basically it was a popularization of the approach which saw bankers take an active role in managing and restructuring the companies that they financed. Morgan and his partners frequently joined company boards and played a direct role in shaping their corporate strategy. This went far beyond traditional lending. It effectively made bankers the key players in America's industrial development. I mean, the impact of this legacy is something we're all too familiar with today. Corporate restructuring, downsizing, right-sizing, all of this stuff affects millions of people around the world today. In history, we see many financial figures come and go, but very few have left as profound of a mark as JP Morgan. You see, history could have taken a very different course if he did not exist. I mean, think about that for a second. Without Morgan's interventions and financial innovations, Wall Street may have never risen to global dominance. I mean, it wouldn't be a stretch to say that America's industrial growth and influence would not be what it is today without JP Morgan's influence. But JP Morgan was, and still remains, a very divisive figure. It's hard to imagine that a man who came from immense wealth and privilege, and was born with a silver spoon essentially, wanted to amass even more wealth and power, no matter what the cost was. That's why his legacy is marked by great successes, but also by very questionable practices. JP Morgan's legacy brings up a lot of questions as well. For example, on one hand you have growth, innovation, and advancement, and on the other hand you have considerations like ethical responsibility, power, and monopoly. What's the right balance? Is there even a balance? Should there be a balance? To some people, Morgan was a visionary, a man who stabilized markets, modernized banking, and laid the foundation of the progress of American industry. Also, he bailed out America twice. But to others, he was a symbol of unchecked power and ruthless financial practices. He was an oligarch, wielding his influence to control industries and manipulate markets for his own profit and growth. Now, if you've made it this far into the video, make sure to drop a $ in the comments. Subscribe if you haven't already, and also check out this video that I made about the Rockefellers. Remember I mentioned the rivalry between Rockefeller and JP Morgan earlier? So I think you'll find this documentary very interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.